My name is Boris Ruger, Vice Chairman of the Munich Security Conference. This is day 3 of the conference, and this is our town hall. Welcome to our town hall. It's a new format that we created last year, and it's been a great success, in my opinion. The good thing about it is that it is very interactive. It allows us to bring in the audience, and that is what we're looking for this morning as well. We're delighted to have Cathryn and Nick and very distinguished guests here to talk about the future of diplomacy, which we believe will be a great future.
Thank you, Boris.
Over to you, Cathryn.
That's what we're here to discuss. So good morning, everybody, or as I would say in my other native language, guten Morgen. We're very happy to have all of you here. Don't fear that if you feel few in numbers, we're not going to have a global and globalist discussion because we're streaming this conversation, so any of your insights will be shared with the outside world and vice versa. We have a few questions here through the app that will come in, and I'm really looking forward to having this as interactive as possible. The Munich Security Conference has been around for 56 years. And of course, it's been a primary locus for diplomacy, maybe less in terms of what happens in the Great Hall, but what happens on the sidelines. So I thought it'd be worth it to think about some of the optimistic things that we already know have come out of this conversation here these last few days, despite the somewhat dire messages we heard from the main stage. This morning we woke up to news of a breakthrough in discussions with the Taliban. Now, how that will work out and whether it will partially be part of our discussion, but it is a diplomatic advance. We know that the Normandy format had a little bit of a revivalist injection on the sidelines of this conversation. And we know that all of our efforts on Libya, again, a little bit of a boost on the sidelines of this conversation. But in the main hall, we heard a very different diagnosis on the state of diplomacy. To quote Federal President Steinmeier, he said, "Year by year, we are distancing ourselves from the goal of international cooperation." And we also saw that we have vastly different diagnostic frames for the state of diplomacy. We heard very different things from Secretary of State Pompeo than we heard from the Europeans on the stage. So I want to probe with this group and with all of you what a new age of global competition does to diplomacy in the wide toolkit. How sports diplomacy, how science diplomacy can help us address all the transnational issues that Boris dealt with in his side event yesterday, from migration to transnational crime, pandemics, coronavirus. Good news again today, the numbers are down. So we want to spend about 40 minutes in this composition, then we're going to rotate some chairs. We want to bring you into the conversation. But I want to say 2 things about why we're doing this, why we're partnering with the MSC. A decade ago, Nicholas Burns, the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political Affairs, the former U.S. Ambassador to NATO, now a professor of practice at the Kennedy School, and I looked around not only the Kennedy School, but the world and the next generation and said, you know, the world of diplomacy is rapidly shifting. And the way that we're looking at it from the perch of academia is too narrow in the lens of conflict. And we said we need to spin this positively, and we need to think about how diplomacy needs to change in the 21st century, the kind of actors that need to play a role in diplomacy in the 21st century. So we created the Future of Diplomacy project, now a decade old, and Nick will talk a little bit about why we did this. But first, please help me in welcoming this group. I will introduce them to you, but good morning to all of you. Please welcome my panel. So Nick, before we jump right in, what was the impetus for our program? Did I get that right? And what is your assessment in a world of global competition of the health of diplomacy today?
Well, good morning. And I want to thank the Munich Security Conference first and Ambassador Ruga and Wolfgang Ischinger for hosting us. Delighted to be here. Looking forward to the other parts of the conversation. As I am a lifelong supporter of Bayern München, I'm really looking forward to Philipp Lahm when he speaks, the captain of the German national team. When I arrived after a career in diplomacy at the State Department at the Kennedy School, I felt that sometimes I was walking into the Kennedy School at Harvard for war, because we had a tremendous capacity to think about the application of military force with the exception of our great professor, Joe Nye, who pioneered a concept of soft power, a lot of our efforts were directed towards the military. And I think in the 21st century, all of us realize that if you think about the big human challenges, climate change, trafficking of human beings, crime and drug cartels, preventing and dealing with pandemics as the Chinese and all of us are experiencing now with the coronavirus, thinking about the cyber conflicts, we need to be creating coalitions. We need to be using our existing alliances like the US-European Union partnership that has been so much diminished over the last several years. And that takes diplomacy. That takes people working together, not thinking about fighting, but thinking about working together to solve major human problems. I think for the 21st century, it's an imperative. And I just say one more thing, Cathryn. As a practicing diplomat for a long time for the United States, we have the advantage of overwhelming force. And sometimes the Americans defaulted in the past too much to the use of force, particularly after 9/11. We had to fight after 9/11 Al-Qaeda. We chose to go into Iraq with disastrous consequences. Sometimes Americans have to relearn the ancient art of diplomacy. Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, talks about this in a very, I think, clear way. He says the United States has two powers in the world. We have the power of intimidation. Everyone knows what that is. That's the military. He said, but the more important power is the power of inspiration. And that comes from any country, Germany, the United States, Spain, our culture, our values, what we stand for. And that's what makes the European Union and the US and NATO special, because we're built on values.
We'll talk about the resilience of those values. We heard a lot from the main stage about whether, from Justin Trudeau, for instance, whether we don't have hubris in the way that we attach democratic base core values of human dignity, if we are over-attaching that to the West, if not, the world has moved on, if democracies in other parts of the world cannot be just as resilient. But to continue first that sort of temperature taking of the state of global diplomacy, in a world of great power competition, David Miliband, as former Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, now on the other side, when we think about whether we're in an era of chessboard diplomacy or whether we're in an era of networked diplomacy where a multiplicity of actors, Nick has already alluded to the role of different actors play a role. What is your assessment of the health?
Well, thank you very much
diplomacy?
for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here. I run an international humanitarian organization, a non-governmental organization. Look, it's simple to me. The ultimate test of diplomacy is whether it prevents wars and stops wars. So by any indicator, diplomacy is in crisis, because there are more wars happening today than at any time since the end of the Cold War, and there are more people fleeing from war than at any time since the Second World War. Now, it's really important to understand that there's a major change within that statistic, which is that there are basically no wars between states at the moment. There are wars within states that countries are fighting proxy wars through. And so the changing nature of conflict requires a different type of diplomacy. I was at West Point. I went to West Point 2 weeks ago and talked about the changing nature of conflict, the challenges it poses for the military, for diplomats, and for humanitarians. We have civil wars, not interstate wars. We have proxy wars, not direct conflict. We have contagious wars that go from one state to another. We have protracted wars, because civil wars aren't just more numerous today than at any time, actually from about 150 years, they are also longer lasting. And they also finally involve non-state actors in growing numbers. It's really striking to me that if you look at the Libyas of this world, it's not a 2 or 3 or 4-sided conflict. If you look at Yemen today, it's 12, 14, 18 different players. And so that says to me that the tools of diplomacy need to be fundamentally rethought if they're to do the fundamental job of diplomacy, which is to prevent and stop war. Now, there's a whole range of concentric circles beyond that core task of diplomacy, and to do with pandemics, to do with global challenges like climate change, which are obviously in some ways existential. But I think unless we're willing to accept that there's a crisis of diplomacy, unless we're willing to reject the happy talk that says, no, it's fine, we're not going to be able to have the radicalism that's necessary, both for the responsibilities of states and for the responsibilities of corporations and foundations, and for the responsibilities of soft power institutions like football clubs, and frankly, for the responsibilities that we have as citizens.
Right. I think that is almost a perfect segue to bring in Natalie. Because if we look about the world in terms of innovative structures, I mean, David's basically said we need a different kind of creativity. We need a different way of bringing different actors to the table and focus them on different issues, because if you now have non-state actors that can claim territory, you have big behemoth organizations like religious organizations on the positive side that can really change the way half the world thinks about climate change, something about the role of the Catholic Church even in focusing how we need to think about transnational issues. One of the biggest innovations in this sphere was the creation of the European External Action Service about 10 years ago, trying to pull together diplomatic actors from all the EU member states, trying to focalize a purpose, a common purpose. And we heard how difficult that is over the course of the last 2 days. And we're going to talk about it more today. Sunday is traditionally Middle East Day at the Munich Security Conference. And here we have 2 sessions on the future and the vision of Europe. So if you think about the EAS, you wrote the global strategy with a high representative for foreign affairs with Federica Mogherini. What's your take on the state of global diplomacy?
Well, I mean, I would agree with David. I mean, I think what we're basically facing a paradox here, because on the one hand, international diplomacy, multilateralism, international cooperation is indeed in crisis. I mean, I think there's no sort of two ways about it. And we see it in all sorts of ways. If we look internally within the European Union, which in many respects is the most radical form of multilateralism that has ever been created, it's clear that, yes, there may be a narrative going on, but there's paralysis in the action, right. Whether we're looking at it in terms of whatever, reform of the Eurozone, moving forward on a common migration policy, or indeed looking at foreign policy question, when it comes to the action, we're blocked. Mm-hmm. We look at, more globally, different sort of spheres in which diplomacy normally delivers, and we basically see international agreements being violated. From the INF, Russia's violation, to the US's walkout on the JCPOA. We look at the way in which the WTO is completely blocked, and where at most diplomacy can achieve bilateral agreements, but it's not moving forward on multilateralism. And then we see, and indeed David I think is absolutely right, the big transnational challenges of our age, be it climate, be it digital, be it demography and migration more broadly, where diplomacy is not delivering, basically. Now, you see this happening. At the same time, what you also see is that diplomacy is needed more than ever, and multilateralism is needed more than ever. Firstly, because of what David was saying, the complexity of conflict. I mean, the minute in which you have conflicts that play out at the local, at the national, at the regional, at the global level, well, very difficult to actually solve them without the patience and the stubbornness of diplomacy. The minute in which you do have transnational challenges such as these, how are you going to solve them if not through diplomacy and multilateralism? So we're basically sort of confronted with this paradox, and sort of trying to sort of think through how to get out of it. Perhaps just kind of three brief ideas, which I think are both applicable to the EU level. I'm thinking, I would say, not only about the EAS, which indeed is an extremely innovative sort of creation of diplomacy, right, because it's this bringing together of the supranational and the intergovernmental, bringing together national diplomats together with supranational officials from the Commission, and also having a more open attitude to sort of non-state stakeholders, because it's a structure which is less fossilized compared to national ministries that have been around for many decades. So the question is, how do we make sure that all this actually delivers and therefore bridges the gap between what we see in practice and what should be happening? I would say a first fundamental aspect is really that of being willing to pay the cost of diplomacy and multilateralism. At times we take years, at times decades to reach agreements, but then when it comes to sticking our necks out in terms of the implementation, we're just not willing to take that cost. And, again, raising the example of the JCPOA, well, we Europeans, we've been talking quite a lot about how important this is, but when push comes to shove, we actually haven't been doing very much in terms of standing up for it when it comes to the implementation. And of course, it does come with a cost. It comes with the cost of transatlantic friction at this moment. But if we actually do want to stand by our words, we have to be willing to take that cost. Same goes for climate. Fantastic achievement in achieving the Paris Climate Agreement several years ago. But where are we in terms of the implementation? And it's not just what we do with respect to the rest of the world, but what we do internally to live up to the success of diplomacy. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of actually implementing diplomacy there where it actually delivers. And then I think you're absolutely right. It's really a question of becoming more creative in the way in which we go about it. And in a sense, shifting away from a sort of static notion of our partnerships into a more fluid understanding of our partnering. And understanding basically, what is the issue at stake here? Are we talking digital? Are we talking climate? Are we talking Ukraine? Which is the configuration of actors, be it state actors or non-state actors, that we actually need to work with in order to get to an agreement? Now, indeed, there will be some that we will tend to partner with more than others. But we need to sort of start with our eye on the ball on what the issue is and what our goals are, and then from there understand who is it that we have to work with in order to deliver. And then last point is really trying to square the circle between legitimacy and representation. And I think this is both an internal European question as well as a broader global question. Because indeed, at times, it's very difficult to actually achieve things at 27. And you simply don't have that agility, that flexibility, that nimbleness that you need to have in order to deliver in a situation in which problems and issues are as complex and as fast-moving as we've seen. So it's a question of creating internal contact groups, but at the same time ensuring that these have legitimacy and therefore are not divisive, which essentially means trying to avoid having always the same member states doing everything, and also retaining a broader link to that broader institutional framework, which is the European Union, and acting likewise at the global level. And therefore working with an international contact group, which then retains institutional links with the broader institutional setting, which obviously cannot but be the United Nations. I mean, there are some examples in which this already takes place. I mean, I already cited Iran, so I will go back to that, but the International Contact Group on Venezuela is another. So it's about, squaring this circle between legitimacy and representation in order, on the one hand, to have that flexibility and that nimbleness that you need, but at the same time being and retaining legitimacy.
So the question of credibility and reputation goes exactly to what is the locus of diplomacy? Natalie's now described that multilateral architecture as we might see it from the 64,000 foot level, but we've heard from others, including Representative Congresswoman Elissa Slotkin, and again from the stage, that we need to make this resonant to all of us. And if voters are constituents, widely spoken, and if we look into the world, and we'll go back to Natalie and thinking about whether the European Union feels alone now in a power struggle of great global competition. But Joe, diplomacy is supposed to lend itself to creating credibility, moral suasion, an attraction. And not only did you invent the idea of soft power, coin it, but more recently you participated in a soft power index, which is the data-driven diagnostic. And so from that perspective, how are we doing?
Well, is the big question. For the United States, we're doing much more poorly than we did recently. The polls show a decline in American attractiveness since Donald Trump took office. I mean, that's just an objective fact, not a partisan statement. But let me step back a little bit and say we need to rethink diplomacy. We have to think of it as what I call three-dimensional diplomacy. Right. Traditional diplomacy was monarch to monarch, or was one to one. And then it became, in the 20th century, one to many. If you think of the speeches of Mussolini and Hitler and Roosevelt, they were one, but speaking to the publics of other countries as well as their own. Today, with social media, it's many to many. Right. So essentially, when you're talking about what's the role of diplomacy, all three parts are important. But if you just focus on the one-to-one and forget the one-to-many and the many-to-many, you're missing what diplomacy is about. Somebody said that, classically, who prevailed depended on whose army was stronger. Mm-hmm. But in this modern age of communication, who wins depends on whose story wins. Story. And when it comes to whose story wins, it's not just the one-to-one, it's not just the one-to-many, which was classically broadcasting. It's the many-to-many, which is social media. And unless we think of diplomacy in all three of those dimensions, we're not going to be able to succeed. If you ask, power, as I've argued, is the ability to affect others to get what you want. You can do it by coercion, by payment, or by attraction. And attraction is soft power. The more you can get others to do what you want because they like your story, they believe your story, without having to use carrots and sticks, the better off you are. And that means that figuring out how to bring in this third dimension, the many-to-manys, is difficult. We really haven't mastered it. Ironically, one of the people who's mastered it in part is Donald Trump. Right. He's been able to use Twitter as an extraordinarily effective weapon, but it's aimed at his own particular base within the United States, which he then uses as a weapon to control the Republican Party. But the same messaging that makes him able to use social media as a weapon to beat Republicans into acquiescence by threatening them with a primary, because he's roused his base, is very unappealing to citizens in third countries. The rest of the world, yes. Every time he says America first, everybody else hears, oh, I'm second. So, that ability to master multiple audiences and to think of diplomacy in three dimensions at the same time, we really haven't mastered that. Trump's mastered a piece of it, but we haven't, if you go back to we, meaning all of us, we haven't mastered that.
Cathryn, can I just come in with something? Because I want to confess to feeling quite a high degree of distress in the last 2 days. The word Huawei has been used, I would estimate, 50 times more often than the word Idlib in the last 2 days. And in Idlib, there are 350 International Rescue Committee staff members working in Idlib at the moment. And at the moment, there are 75,000 families with children under trees in minus 11 degree centigrade, while their homes are being bombed and missiled. And I would like, I can see a lot that I understand from what Joe has said that is plausible and in some ways attractive. But let's be honest, hard power is showing its strength.
Correct.
At the moment. The narrative that killing children is a bad thing may be strong, but the reality is that it's not winning against the fact that that is happening, because 250 people have been killed in the last 2 months in western Syria. And the international lessons of diplomacy that were learned in the most appalling ways 75, 80 years ago are being unlearned. Replayed. Because after the Second World War, people said never again. They wrote rights for individuals alongside rights for states in international law. And international diplomacy, far from defending those international laws, is actually being used to excuse the abuse of those international laws. So I don't want to be kind of melodramatic about it.
Can I just answer David?
And I need to go to Nick after this.
But then on that third dimension I was mentioning, somebody should ask Lavrov at the Munich Security Conference, how do you justify dropping barrel bombs on hospitals?
Correct.
And when that gets into the public and that narrative gets spread, we've got to think of more ways to link those things.
Nick, you made almost that exact point yesterday on Twitter when we were sitting next to one another. But speaking of structures that intervene, and to Joe's point about the president taking the primacy of direct communication and in essence breaking the American diplomatic system, sending thugs into Ukraine to get his objectives done, widely spoken, hollowing out the State Department in an extremely dangerous fashion, though arguably the State Department for a country of its size, for a long time, an extremely nimble force, extremely focused on these arriving transnational challenges. So if you think about John Kerry's piece about putting climate change as a threat multiplier across all of American foreign policy strategy. I mean, how do we get back to enabling American diplomacy to tackle exactly those issues?
Well, first I just want to pick up where my friend David left off. I thought it was a real missed opportunity by the Munich Security Conference not to highlight the most important thing happening in the world today. 830 or 40,000 refugees produced just in the last couple of weeks because the Russian Air Force, the Syrian government, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and Hezbollah have launched a coordinated attack on the civilians of Idlib province, not on any military force, designed to drive people out so that Assad and his foreign helpers can consolidate control over the north. And you have the Turks coming in from the opposite side. It is the most serious humanitarian crisis produced by this war in 11 years. The pre-war population of Syria was 22.4 million in 2010. At least 12 million, the majority of the people, have become refugees inside their country or outside their country, in Iraq and Lebanon and Turkey, and of course here in Germany and other parts of Europe. And the fact that President Macron, whom I greatly admire, gave this talk yesterday about finding a way, let's open channels to Russia, and let's find trust in Russia. Not a single word of criticism by President Macron. Not a single word of criticism by someone else I respect, the President of Germany, in his opening speech on Friday afternoon. This should have been the biggest issue at the conference. And if Joe's right, and he is, that diplomacy is not one-dimensional, it's multi-dimensional, here was an opportunity. This is the greatest collection of global leaders in foreign and defense policy every year. This is a much more important conference than Davos in that respect. This was the weekend where the Munich Security Conference should have shifted to David's issue. And David's, running the biggest refugee organization in the United States, one of the biggest in the world. That's the most important thing happening. So we have to be supple and use our tools publicly, I think, on this kind of thing.
Yeah, you're not going to shoot down Russian planes over Idlib. However, you can make sure that Putin's story doesn't win.
Well, there you
So
go.
what we should be doing is dramatizing at this third dimension of diplomacy, David's story. And undercutting Putin's story.
Right.
That's right. And so I did tweet out yesterday, someone has to ask Lavrov about this. That should have been the dominant issue for Lavrov this weekend.
I do want to go back to this point. Boris, did you want to come in on that point particularly?
I've been told that we come in later. So.
Oh, very true. But I mean, look, but we've made the point that at a venue here, you're the vice chairman of the MSC. I think it would be good to have you come in.
Well, just to speak to Nick's point, I think, of course, in many ways you're right, but I think it's also true, as Cathryn pointed out, for the last X years, the Munich Security Conference has devoted Sunday to the Middle East. So we've gone over this issue again and again, and I think the sense is that we've exhausted the tools, number one, and number two, that as far as the European Union is concerned, and this was at the center of President Macron's speech, we have to organize ourselves in such a way as to be able to act against these kinds of conflicts or to take action, to be an effective and capable foreign policy actor in the face of this brute use of force, in the face of the massive violation of international norms, because we have not been that. And so we can talk about that. The difficulty is we can talk about it, we can publicize it. I think that the atrocities committed by Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime have been publicized widely at various times. However, it has not had an impact. The world has become numb to these statistics. So I think the core of what we should be discussing here from a German and European point of view is how do we put ourselves in a situation where diplomatically and otherwise we are capable of dealing with those great powers.
Can I was going to say, we're going to have Natalie speak to that. I do want to go back to Nick on the silence of the American voice, arguably.
Well, it's connected to silence, actually, because I think, and it relates to the issue of stories, because what we have done, and we've done it in Syria, we've done it in Libya, I mean, we've done it pretty much everywhere. We keep on saying there is no military solution. And we say it and say it and say it all over again, but then, of course, there are military outcomes.
Right.
And we do nothing about them. And there are military outcomes that we do nothing about. And this is also leading to a slightly odd situation in which who is ending up, quote unquote, mediating in this conflict are precisely the actors that are participating in those military outcomes. We
have an interest in continued dysfunction.
Yes, and they present themselves almost supplanting the role that has traditionally been that of, for instance, the United Nations. But who has been mediating in Syria over the last years? Well, it's Russia.
Exactly.
Turkey.
Well, Russia has become the kingmaker in the region, but this gets back to American capacity, American absence, and it gets back to an American story, which, because of how the system is constructed, because we have this president, the power of the pulpit has changed.
So let's just keep on this question of Syria. I think all of us have agreed that diplomacy is in crisis. One of the reasons why is that the strongest country still, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but the country with greatest capacity, the United States, is essentially opting out of its traditional diplomatic role of helping to organize around crises. And you have to do that through institutions. When Secretary Pompeo stood on the stage yesterday, I thought the speech was atonal. The tone was wrong. Here he is in Germany, and yet not a good word for the German government or for the Chancellor of Germany, who's been attacked unceasingly by our president.
Well, and
publicly.
the narrative of winning doesn't work for
And
Germany.
of course, the president said last week, our president, he said the European Union was created to harm the United States, which is completely untrue. If you look at the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy administrations, we encouraged the coal and steel community, the Treaty of Rome, the Common Market, the Euro, Maastricht,
wouldn't
and all
exist
that.
without the United States.
Right.
But if you go to war against, if you say, from an American perspective, Mike Pompeo yesterday, we don't care about the European Union, we only care about sovereignty. If you delegitimize NATO, if you don't invest in United Nations authorities, and Natalie was talking about multilateralism, then how do you respond to a crisis like this? And David has to be the one to respond because the states, well, David's organization, because the states are not doing it.
Right.
And so the United States should be relearning in a complex world where our power is reduced relative to others, relearning the art of diplomacy, and yet we appear to be retreating into a unilateral corner, and that's a real shame for a country like ours.
I want to make sure we get your voices into this discussion before we begin to open our conversation to include other voices physically in these chairs. I want to make sure we bring your expertise in. You have the apps here. If you want to start raising your hands, I'm happy to bring you in on this. We want to talk a little bit more about the functional role and how diplomacy has changed. I want to circle back to Natalie on this multilateralist piece. The European Union, despite the fact that it's been squeezed by global competition, has actually done quite a bit even in these difficult years where the United States has seemingly, to Nick's point, stepped away from its global role in terms of trade agreements. I'm thinking Mercosur, I'm thinking Japan, I'm thinking a number of those elements that really add heft and meaning as long as you tell the story correctly. And we heard just from the stage with Emmanuel Macron making a push not for the defense dimension within European politics, not for the defense dimension alone, but in borrowing an American phrase, in order to be an effective actor in the world, Europe needs a diplomacy that's backed by force. You were so close, and you just made a point about how decisions, for instance, decisions on Libya, if we don't act with responsibility, they will come home to haunt us. So how do you build that bridge? How do you tell that story in a way that it's resonant for Europeans?
I mean, see, I think, as Europeans over the last years, I think our story, we kind of got the story right in terms of what we say. And you're absolutely right in terms of some of the things that we've been doing, we have been moving in this direction. And, indeed, I think, sort of on the trade agenda, swimming against the tide of protectionism is certainly something that the European Union has done. Stepping up in paying basically for UN agencies as the United States has retreated is also something that we have done. So I don't want to diminish the value of some of these things. My point, though, is that often the narrative hasn't really lived up, or rather the action hasn't really lived up to the grandiose narrative about how existential, because these are the terms that we use, to us diplomacy and multilateralism are existential. Well, if they are existential, why is it that we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing in Libya or in Syria or on the JCPOA or on climate or on the reform of the WTO? Why is it that we're not doing it? And I think it's too easy when it comes to the European Union to basically sort of focus on two traditional problems. It's divisions between member states, stupid. Or we don't have the instruments. Well, I mean, let's take the case of Libya, to move to a different example. Yes, obviously member states are divided. Italy and France have different positions. Are our differences really greater than our agreement concerning the fact that it's not in anyone's interest for the shots to be entirely called by Russia, Turkey, and UAE? I mean, really, do we not agree on this more than how much we disagree concerning where the balance should tilt towards Serraj and Haftar? And is it really that we don't have the instruments to do it? I mean, we're not talking about a major intervention. I mean, we're not talking 2011. We're actually talking about eventually consolidating a ceasefire on the ground, which has obviously its civilian element, but it has its force protection element.
Right.
We actually have those capabilities.
Yeah.
So it's a question of making that psychological step towards action and assuming responsibility, which implies that we have to move out of the formamentis of assuming that someone else is going to do it for us.
Right, but the scourge of nationalism, David, and I'm looking at you because you're from a country that has asserted its own island onto itself. That nationalism has dictated the Brexit campaign. Now we're trying to figure out what the famous Churchillian three concentric circles are going to look like for Britain in the future. Its options. What role does this extreme nationalism play in preventing, or this rising tide of nationalism, specifically in Europe, but as you look across the world, in preventing this kind of concerted action and the narrative of concerted action?
Well, I think that we have to see that globalization is breaking down. And it's breaking down because, in my view, it's too unequal and unsustainable for its own good. And the maldistribution of the fruits of the global dividend that's been achieved over the last 30 or 40 years, I think underpins a really zero-sum politics that is dominating not just in democratic countries, but in autocratic countries as well. My own instinct is that at a time when politics is in retreat, when governments are in retreat, citizens, NGOs, and businesses have to step up. My recipe, I always say to people, if you think about big social and economic and political changes around the world, they take three things. They take government leadership, they take business and NGO innovation, and they take mass mobilization. The big changes of the last century have all had those three elements, but they don't have to happen in that order. And when government leadership is missing, you have to look either to business or NGO innovation or to mass mobilization if you are to make progress. And I think that the theme of this conference, Westlessness, was very well chosen, but it hasn't been properly discussed. Westlessness, in respect of the debate we were having 10 minutes ago, is about lawlessness. But it's also about the retreat of liberal democratic politics.
Right.
And I don't want to make this too complicated, but 113 countries have suffered reductions in political freedom in the last 13 years. That means less independent judiciary, less free elections, less free media. That is a phenomenon, a political phenomenon that is part of the diplomatic landscape. So when people say there's been a shift of power from west to east, they're obviously right. But there's also been a shift of power from liberal democratic countries to autocratic countries. That is the context in which the nationalism that you refer to is growing. My own instinct, I was in the US, I live and work in the US, so I was there for the 2016 election. I was very surprised by the way the Democrats responded to the America First claim. Was it almost sounded like they believed in America Second. Whereas the argument they should have made was, no, if you want America first, you should be an internationalist, not a nationalist. And I feel that that's where the citizen and business, or the NGO and business responsibility lies. If we wait for politics to catch up, I think we're going to be in a much more dangerous position.
I agree with David. I have just written a book comparing the 14 presidents since 1945. And what's most striking is that the early presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, even Bush 41, had a broad conception of national interest. To say that America first in itself isn't bad, it'd be odd if Macron didn't say France first. However, it's how you define the national interest where the moral component comes in. And the early presidents defined it in a broad enough way that it proves public goods for others. Others were part of it. I mean, when you have a Marshall Plan, when you have NATO, when you have an open international trading system, a stable monetary system, everybody benefits. And whereas with Trump, what you've seen is a deterioration to its transaction by transaction. Did I win and you lose on that transaction, then we go to the next transaction. The trouble with that is the base is the currency. It means that there's no trust anymore. And the danger of that, to go back to what I said earlier, is our story loses. With the early presidents, we had a story which could attract others. There's a famous statement by Georg Lundstad. He said, yes, there's an American empire in Europe, but it's an empire by invitation. We want them here. Today, with Trump, you don't have that feeling of invitation because of the way he's narrowly defined it. So I think what David says is just right. If we're going to think of what's next in public diplomacy, on both that one to many and the many to many, it's got to be that everybody's included. And I think that's where we're failing.
Well, this is an almost perfect segue to bring in Lassina Zerbo into this conversation. He's the executive secretary of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. We know, all of us, that though it was put in place more than 2 decades ago, it's not fully ratified by a number of nuclear power countries, and yet it has been one of the forefront organizations in getting to some of the points that David and Joe raised, which is to say we need innovation, we need data, we need a better understanding for the complexity of the problems of today, and that in fact ways of opening toward solutions and to look at multilateral solutions is in fact through disciplines like science diplomacy. And yet science diplomacy, the use of data, the use of information, the direct contact of that data hasn't always been as closely defined. And I wanted to ask you how, now that you have the Madrid Declaration, what is that definition of science diplomacy for you, and how does it feed in to mitigating some of these complexities, creating an innovative environment?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. The Munich Security Conference, I think that's my 6th or 7th Munich Security Conference. Being involved in soft power issue, hard power, science diplomacy is interesting. But before I get into the science diplomacy, if you allow me to react to some of the points that were made, especially globalization, multilateral diplomacy, is it dying? Is it in crisis? And what aren't we doing right? I think I wanted to say that what is not done right today, it's the assessment of how the world has changed compared to the diplomacy that we're trying to apply. That is, 50 years diplomacy. If you take globalization and how it impacts Africa, I just spent a month in Burkina Faso, my home country, trying to understand the issue of the terrorism in Sahel, talking to people. I mean, if you go to the darkest corner of Burkina Faso, people have a smartphone and then that can link and then listen to us talking to Munich Security Conference, not even knowing what this conference is all about. And this is what has changed. And what has changed as well is education, capacity development in those countries have put together a critical mass of intellectuals that are now reacting to the way they perceive diplomacy from the West or diplomacy from the North. And we're not dealing with this, I think, in a way where we can integrate them and then get them to think strategically as we deal with global issue. I think that's what the world is not doing right, and that is impacting and not letting the implementation of the outcome of multilateral issue to be taken into account seriously. So now coming into science diplomacy, science goes across boundaries. You mentioned JCPOA, you mentioned climate change, and I can mention the CTBT. The CTBT is one of the endorsement of great scientific cooperation, people who have assessed the world and look at the situation where we stand with regard to nuclear testing, with regard to the challenges that nuclear threat pose to the world, and then decided to put together a verification mechanism and system that will monitor the planet and making sure that no nuclear test explosion goes undetected. So we're using science to tell the world we have no other choice than verifying what could happen so that we can save our planet from nuclear testing and therefore from the development of nuclear weapon. So we endorse something, but are we respecting it? And that's the situation. So if we decide to have a treaty that is science-based, are we respecting its implementation, and are we respecting our diplomatic power or soft power or inspirational power to get people to adhere to it and to make it universal so that we deal with what we wanted to do, which is security for all. I think that's where the problem lies.
But then, so everything that you've mapped out takes a number of stakeholders, a number of actors. How do you think about, from your vantage point, working with not only the scientific actors, the verification community, critical on the Iran question, critical on questions of North Korea, if we think even about how we might build a wider architecture on arms control. How do you bring in these different levers, advocacy organizations, NGOs? How do you bring your message to a wider audience?
Look, when you talk about, let me go back to the implementation and the verification that you just mentioned. If you take countries that have signed into this treaty and where we putting into place the international monitoring system, one thing is to agree to adhere to a treaty, but the other thing is to agree to build the station that will serve the international community. If you don't build the station that will serve the international community and then provide data to serve the international community, you're not contributing to what you've signed in. And that's one of the biggest challenges. So how do we deal with it? We talk about civil society. We talk about educating people and getting them to understand exactly the meaning of this, I would say, institutional framework. But what I've come up with is to involve youth, because they're the one changing the world. And we've had the CTBT youth group that is now nearly 900 people, from nearly 100 countries. I mean, they're going around spreading the words for the importance of security, the importance of verification, the importance of our international monitoring system, and they're doing the job for us. You talk about 900 people, they're more than the 400 that I have in Vienna. So they're doing the work for us in a way where their voice will be heard through social media, mentioned by Joe, and then it will be heard more because there will be no refrain from the sensitivity that will come, that I could have when I'm dealing or even talking right now. How do I affect one side of the world as opposed to the other side? And that's the difficulty that we have in multilateral diplomacy and implementing what states are asking us to do.
Can I just interject? Absolutely. That's a wonderful thought. It didn't occur to me to have a Greta Thunberg for the CTB. Great. Let's have more.
I want to bring in some of your questions because I'm seeing hands go up. So go ahead. Just, I'm not sure if we have a microphone, but we're cozy here. You can project.
Okay, so I'm going to take a 60,000 feet view because as someone who's sort of gone through the last 2 days, it's very interesting. The topic right now is diplomacy debt. Okay, my view is the objectives of diplomacy have changed diametrically and drastically in the last few years, not even last 10 years. With the coming of Trump, the objectives of diplomacy have ceased to be win-win. It's become binary. I win, you lose, you win, I lose, right? And if you take a 60,000 feet view, it's interesting because the Europeans, both Steinmeier and Macron, exceptionally impressive, seem to have all the solutions, no way to implement it. The Americans, who have to lead on coalescing the world in trying to find solutions to things like climate change, which affect all of us. But because it affects all of us, it doesn't remain a primary responsibility of a single state. So the Americans, however, seem to have really taken a completely different view. And right now, frankly speaking, American diplomacy, every time the Americans start speaking, it's about Huawei and China and fair, and we shut off. It's like Pakistan and India taking a go at each other. You all shut off because you know what to expect. So instead of leading, it's fair. Fair is what is right now. So you are, my last point. So basically what has happened is in reaction to the fear that you are feeling right now from China, you have decided to give up on your biggest asset, which is soft power, and decide to fight on the hard power, on which they might compete. On soft power, you have the advantage. You're happily giving that away.
Nick, are we giving it away?
Oh gosh, we could organize an entire course around that brilliant question at any of our universities. I just say a couple of things. I mean, it's no secret that I'm opposed to President Trump. I'm supporting Joe Biden for president. I think that the United States has lost its way because, we have immense power in the world, but on issue after issue, we can't get much done on limiting arms without international organizations, on refugees without the organization that David and his group provides. And so we've got to come back to thinking about the United States leading and working as an equal with others. But I wouldn't just put the blame on the United States. Frankly, you have big authoritarian powers, China and Russia in Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, acting as an imperial power against all the rules of the international system. China running roughshod over the Philippines and Vietnam and Brunei, Malaysia and Taiwan and the Spratly and Paracel Islands. So I actually think that Westlessness is an important concept. There's a strength in the West. The West is not geographic.
Yeah.
It's a state of mind about the kind of world we want to live in. And if what Boris and Wolfgang have put before us, I think you've been quite right to do it, challenge us to reform a universal set of democratic countries that can argue for the principles that we think are right. I think that's what we've got to do. I would just say this, don't lose faith in the Americans. There's another America out there. And if you look at our public opinion polls, it's Republicans and Democrats who believe in our alliances in East Asia and here in NATO, believe in the European Union, believe in free trade. And by narrower margins, this is very contested in our politics, narrower margins, but majority of Americans believe we're still an immigrant society. We should accept refugees, and we should be open to the rest of the world. There's that America. It's there.
Yeah.
We just need to uncover it on November 3rd, 2020.
Can I just come in
Chicago
because
Council poll.
Hina
Yes.
is far too modest. She's an outstanding diplomat in her own right. She didn't introduce herself as a former foreign minister of Pakistan. Look, I want to make a link between the international and the domestic. 2019 was the first year in 120 years when the aggregate GDP of autocratic countries was greater than the aggregate GDP of democratic countries. And at some level, economic power and political power go together. And so the argument about soft power is not just a rarefied idea. We've got to take on and show that we can, in deeds as well as words, we can show that actually liberal democratic politics is the way to deliver for your own citizens. And we should be concerned not just about the failings of liberal democratic European countries or American countries or other countries to get together at the international level. We should be really concerned about the failure to deliver at home because they're linked and there are some common elements.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and isn't this the point? In fact, I'd really like to hear what Joe thinks about this. I mean, isn't the problem here that there may be a link, I don't think empirically proved, between the nationalist populism in our own societies and the perception of success of autocratic countries? Often I'm asked in, Italy, so what's the deal here? How much money is there? How much money does Putin send to Salvini? Well, obviously there is money involved, but compared to the actual success of that story, that money is peanuts. In the same way as it was probably peanuts how much money the United States had to spend during the Cold War in order to make its model look attractive to others, because it kind of spoke for itself. So is there a relationship between the nationalist populism in our own societies and the growth of the perceived success, be it in strategic terms or be it in economic terms, of autocratic
Democracy
countries?
is not delivering.
Well, it's very clear that if you look at the polls in the United States after the Great Recession of 2008, which was originated with us, it was our fault, you found not only a decline in attraction to the U.S. externally, but you also found less tolerance of immigration. You found less tolerance of an external foreign policy. So clearly, bad economic performance has a negative effect on populism at home. And what's encouraging, though, to pick up Nick's point, is I was looking at a poll last night that Pew has just produced. In 2014, 2012, the American people were anti-immigration. By 2016 already, even though Trump was using it as a weapon, we're pro-immigration again. And similarly, whereas in 2014, on climate change, the ratio was something like 70% who thought the economy is all that mattered, and only 30% cared about climate change. That's now, under better economic conditions, changed so that you have 50% saying climate change is a priority issue. I would say that if I were to make a bet, that the next president, whoever he or she is, and whether it's 20 or 24, one of the first things she'll do is rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. And the American did enormous damage to its soft power by pulling out of that for no good reason at all. And there, to give credit to China, since everybody likes to bash China, China's performance on climate change is better than ours. They're still in Paris.
Well, but you also have, this gets to, I think, a question that Ambika is going to ask. I want to bring Lassina into that piece too, because you do have 287, to Nick's point about another America, 287 American cities, a state as powerful as California, if you ranked federal states alongside countries, sixth biggest economy in the world, saying that we're not going to sign up to that. So there are, while we can diagnose the brokenness, there are some things that are still very much working. And in part, I want to say data, knowing just how this avalanche is coming at us of climate change is critical in making that argument, so you can sustain components of subnational diplomacy, so that narrative can find a way of resonating. Lassina.
Yeah, data is indeed important. In my preliminary remark, I mentioned the importance of connecting the world with data from the station that we put around the planet. I want to give an example on United States contributing to the organization that I had, to its organizational setting and the technical aspect. Why? It's because there is important and useful data for United States national security. And that's why they're still contributing to this organization and getting a great value for money out of it. The hic is, why aren't they linking it to the treaty? Those are domestic and political issues that are beyond my paycheck. But I'm just mentioning the importance of data in arms control, non-proliferation, disarmament, climate change issue, any scientific framework that feeds diplomacy today is important, because we're gathering data. Yesterday I was listening to Mark Zuckerberg about the importance of data and also cyber attack and cyber security issues. I think data is becoming important because data is at the fingertip of anyone in the corners of Africa, in the corners of Latin America, the same as it is in the United States. I'm amazed by my mother, who is over 80 today. She's educated, but at a much lower level. But she opened a smartphone, and then she can access and then look at video of us talking here. And it's amazing to see that today in Burkina Faso. And it changes the world. It changes the perception of the world and understanding of what we do. So data is becoming important, but we have to allow people to be educated to understand the way they use data. And that leads me, if you allow, to a point that was mentioned, the notion of liberal democracy. I mean, liberal democracy comes and goes with education. If you go to a country where you have 90% of people who hardly speak or write or are educated, how do we help them with democracy? They will follow the minority of people who are making the laws, and that's not democracy. And I think that's one of the issues that we see in the developing world that one has to deal with. Education is important, and then we have to help people to be educated to understand liberal democracy and why it's important for them to be secure and safe, and then to face development the best way.
So we're going to try to do a wide bridge. I want David to come in on this point, but Ambika has a question on subnational diplomacy.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to take off from what Nina said about soft power, which I think is so important, and climate that you brought in, and the 274 cities, is that
78.
78. So the U.S. backtracked on the climate agreement, but a lot of the cities in the country decided that they weren't going to go along with that. And so then coming to connect to the soft diplomacy, I want to bring in the whole idea of urban centers and how they fit in. Do I need a mic? Okay, sorry. And urban centers and city diplomacy, right? I mean, you talked about 3 pillars, and I want to add a 4th pillar over there and sort of ask a question to anybody who wants to answer, even Cathryn, because she is the leading voice on this right now, is how cities and centers, so we talk about non-state actors, and I want to say small state actors, how do they play into this whole debate and this whole game? It's something I work on a lot, especially in the field of water and environment and cities and how they matter. So maybe we bring in cities as well into this conversation.
Well, it gets back to that linkage that we were making before about direct democracy and the resonance of diplomacy, and how we have to bring these topics closer to the individual. And arguably in the cities in which we all live, that connective tissue is strong. And if we can break it down with the help of data, with the help of advocacy, you talked about education. David's IRC is doing incredible work in refugee camps to begin early childhood education in a way that builds these integrated societies, refugee camps becoming cities, as we're seeing around the globe because of the crisis that we have at hand. Tying all these elements together, David, how does that resonate? What, bringing in the urban actors, bringing in that sort of empathic, direct component in the work that you do?
I don't know the answer to that. They say in America, I've learned in America that people say that's a great question, and they say that a lot. And that generally means that they don't know the answer. So that is a great question. I mean, I think I would go back to the point that the resources for a more connected world have never been greater. The resources to solve the world's problems have never been greater. But those resources are being colonized for malign purposes rather than for benign or even positive purposes. I think that the challenge, I kind of said this before, unless we get serious about recognizing the limitations, the retreat of national governments from global problems and take responsibility elsewhere, we're going to struggle. So what you, sir, are doing with 900 people on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, that's impressive. The question is, how do you make it not 900 people, but 900,000 people, and then 9 million people, and then you make it a real mass movement? And the truth is, we've not solved that. We're an operational agency that helped probably 27 million people last year who were displaced by war and disaster. We're out there doing health, education, water and sanitation, survival. We've not cracked how to mobilize conscience, but also mobilize people in a serious way. I think that you mentioned the environmental movement. Look, the tragedy is that the huge numbers of people who see this as an existential crisis haven't found a way to mobilize, to exercise global pressure in a way that is consistent with the nature of the problem. And I don't think we should kid ourselves. I think we're up against some very malign actors, and we have to understand that the need to operationalize the kind of conscience and the kind of connections that you're talking about here is important. I would say one more thing. I think your point about cities and subnational level of governance is really important. When you think that California is the sixth largest entity in the world, you're really struck. I also think, though, unless you pair it with the idea of mobilizing corporate power, you're not going to get anywhere. 69 of the 100 largest entities in the world are not countries or cities or states, they're corporations. And so you have to think, how are you going to mobilize corporate power, pressure corporate power, as well as mobilize subnational power?
So I think with that, we're going to build a bridge to that whole empathic piece of building individual capacity, corporate, non-governmental, urban, and connecting what we need to be rebuilding, possibly, as we've discussed in this crisis, to what moves us. As Philipp Lahm says, to passion. So with that, I would like to ask Hassan Al-Thawadi to join our circle. I would ask Philipp Lahm to join our circle. And Philipp and Nick, I'm going to have to displace you for that. So David, sorry. No, quite the contrary. So in order to do that, I want to keep you in this conversation. I very much want to keep you mic'd up. But what we seem to be hearing in here is a little bit of a crisis of confidence. And what Joe said, we're missing a connection. We're missing that message. And I'm struck both of you have been deeply involved in creating a vividness for people, that international connection, direct exchange, not just via Twitter diplomacy, not via technology, is critically important. And we'll discuss whether or not that creates enough resonance to make a difference on the wider political stage. Hassan Al-Thawadi, you're in charge of realizing the World Cup 2022 in Qatar. Yep. We know Qatar is going to play a increasingly large role on our Afghan piece, but you're really looking at how bringing the world together, and you've done incredible work in revitalizing your country, not without controversy in the beginning, and not without really difficult issues. So what are your hopes in terms of diplomacy for the region, in terms of what we've already seen, that this World Cup is going to bring for Qatar?
I think it's important to point out, when, what our perspective is on sports and what sports really plays in terms of our lives. From day one, we recognized that, the World Cup in particular, football in particular, moves people in profound ways. It really does touch people's hearts. And I think, one of the things that, as I was listening to everybody speaking here, just to take a step back, is how to reach the average individual. Everything that we talk about when we talk about diplomacy, everything we talk about when it comes to numbers and data, it's tangible, it's scientific, it's fantastic. But the question is, does the average individual get touched by it? Do they get moved by it? That's what we're suffering today. We're not actually reaching the average person walking down the street, whether it's in Liverpool, whether it's in LA or so on. And we realize that sports is a platform that you can actually reach people. You can actually reach every single home throughout the globe. And we wanted to make sure that we utilize this event as a transformative event, touching base, whether it's using it as a vehicle for social development and social progress within Qatar that passes on to the region, or using it as a platform to break down stereotypes. It goes without saying, I think our part of the world suffers from significant perception issues, misperception. People see us as a very, with a certain lens, and we actually look at the outside world with a different lens. But what we found is when people get together in a sporting event, all that breaks away. People actually celebrate, people get together, stereotypes break away, even though people make exceptions for individuals, but they still make exceptions. Mm-hmm. They no longer paint everybody with the same brush. And that's what we're using. We're using this tournament. Over the last 10 years, we've worked very diligently to not only create opportunities for the people of our region so that the benefits last beyond it, but also to use it as a platform to break down that stereotype.
Right. But that's particularly, that's the point that I want to turn to Joe to. Joe, if we think about the great achievements in sports diplomacy, we think of ping pong diplomacy with China, but we also think about the recent Olympic Games, North Korea, South Korea, joint teams. To Hassan's point, does that last? Does that create enough of an opening so that on the wider stage that we were just discussing, the 30,000 foot view, does it make a lasting difference?
I think it does. I mean, sports is one of the areas where you have a common denominator. If you go into a barber shop, I don't have to go very often, but if you go into a barber shop and don't have anything to say to the barber, talk sports. Before you know it, it's a friendship. It cuts across class barriers. If you look at the impact that an immigrant player has on a team which otherwise was purely national, but he scores the critical goal, all of a sudden there's a better feeling toward immigrants. So there are lots, I mean, sports does have a very, very powerful effect, and it can have some lasting effects across nations. Most of the examples I gave are within the solidarity of one nation. But you also have to realize sports can be divisive. Just to go to the case of Qatar, I think it's wonderful what Qatar is doing about the World Cup, but it made the Saudis, your neighbors, say, oh my God, what's this little country trying to be first place when we are first place in the Gulf?
Well, more than Saudis as well, but yes.
And you paid a certain price for that.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, let me just address the point, if you don't mind. I think just, one, to the question of, is it a spark that goes away? Look, it is a spark. But it's on us to actually make the most out of it. It's on us to fan the flame and to actually benefit out of it beyond that immediate.
Can you speak
benefit.
exactly how that relates to the blockade that we're in? I mean, how you've already seen.
Well, I mean, we've seen, for us, let's start off by when we won in 2010, right? In the 2nd of December, when we won, we received phone calls. Literally, we had random people throughout the region just calling any Qatari number, just congratulating us. The public euphoria that we faced at that time was on a people-to-people level was fantastic. It really was all-inspiring. Every time we traveled and we meet anybody from any part of the Arab world or the region, let's not limit it to the Arab world. We're talking about the MENA region from North Africa all the way down to include also Iran, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. There is a great amount of excitement for this tournament. So there is that populace support and excitement for this event. Now, of course, we suffered from an illegal blockade from foreign nations. I think partly it was the World Cup. That's why a lot of people back home love me so much. But I think also there's other issues as well. But whenever it came to sporting events, despite sometimes the acrimonious buildup, you find things calming down a little bit. And if we look at, for example, last year, we hosted the Gulf Cup, which is basically a football tournament that the nations in the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, participate in every 2 years. There was, up until the last minute, there was a doubt whether the three nations, Bahrain, Emirates, and Saudi, would participate. At the last minute, they did. They joined in. The fans came over, and when you saw the way the fans engaged, leave aside the teams themselves, but the way the fans themselves engaged, Bahrain won the cup for the first time. You had about 2,000, 3,000 fans, Bahraini fans there, celebrating, excited, celebrating His Highness the Emir handing over the trophy to a Bahraini player. Mm-hmm. So there's a thawing in relationships. Now, obviously, it goes back and forth, and it will always go back and forth. And yes, it can be a divisive power. And it needs
the other elements for it to come together.
It needs all of us to, and this is just one last point. Yeah. We underestimate the power of sports, and we underutilize the power of sports. We pay lip service to the power of sports in terms of bring a player, sign a ball, do this, and that's it. Fantastic. That's the message delivered. But it's a much more immersive, much more hardworking requirement on a day-to-day basis to extract that benefit for the spark to turn into a flame.
I want to ask Philipp Lahm about who needs no introduction in these halls, but he's here today in his new function as the managing director of the DFB Euro for the Euro 2024. But I want to ask you about a time, and I'll say this in German in just a second, where you played a critical role at reconfiguring the way that this country particularly sees itself on the world stage and the way that the DFB worked with the German diplomatic service in changing the impression of this country, and that's the Sommermärchen 2006. Als Spieler haben sie eine Mannschaft zusammengeführt 2006 und als Land haben wir uns als Gastgeber präsentiert. Das hat nachhaltig gewirkt, glaube ich, auf den Blick der Welt auf dieses Land, aber umgekehrt auch das erste Mal Deutschen gezeigt, dass wir nicht mit überheblichem Patriotismus oder mit Nationalismus gar unserer Geschichte in die Welt gehen müssen, sondern mit einem Selbstbewusstsein für das, was wir geleistet haben. Und Sinnbild dafür war die deutsche Nationalmannschaft, aber auch das, was Menschen hier erlebten. Das heißt, wie nachhaltig, wie lange kann so ein Effekt anhalten? Welche Auswirkungen kann das Ihrer Meinung nach haben auf die internationale Politik?
Ich glaube, dass es nicht ausschlaggebend nur die Mannschaft war, die auf dem Feld stand, sondern wie wir uns als Land und jeder Einzelne in unserem Land Deutschland repräsentiert hat. Ich glaube trotzdem, dass man immer wieder so ein Gemeinschaftsgefühl immer wieder braucht. Also es hält über eine Zeit lang an, aber wir hatten sicher vor 2006 in Deutschland auch andere Probleme, als die wir jetzt haben. Wir haben viel über die Probleme, die entstanden sind, gesprochen, oder es wurde sich hier ausgetauscht. Die Globalisierung hat sicher was Positives, auch die Digitalisierung. Ja. Es bringt viele Gewinner hervor, aber es gibt eben auch Verlierer. Und die darf man nicht verlieren auf dem ganzen Weg, sondern man muss dann eben die Institutionen, die wir haben, wie zum Beispiel der Deutsche Fußballbund, die muss man stärken, weil die übernehmen Verantwortung, dass man ganz, ganz viele Leute erreicht im Fußball, auf der ganzen Welt. Fußball ist ein großartiger Sport, die Leute kommen zusammen. Es spielt keine Rolle, woher man ist. Es spielt keine Rolle, ob man arm, reich ist. Es spielt keine Rolle, woher die Eltern sind. Es spielt alles keine Rolle im Fußball. Man kommt zusammen, man trifft sich, man tauscht sich aus. Und deswegen ist so ein Gemeinschaftsgefühl und dass es solche Turniere gibt, dass man zusammenkommt an einem Ort, enorm wichtig.
Es war aber schon noch eine interessante Fusion, wenn man so will, zwischen einem Auswärtigen Amt, in dem Boris Ruge war, und des Deutschen Fußballbunds, um wirklich nicht nur das Image Deutschlands in der Welt zu verändern, aber wir haben es jetzt 2014 von einem Bundespräsidenten Gauck hier gehört, Deutsche Verantwortung in der Welt, und dann wieder vor einigen Tagen von einem Bundespräsident Steinmeier, der sagt, wir können uns nicht wegducken. Aber und zwar nicht nur von unseren nationalen Themen, sondern eben auch von dem Thema, was wir hier besprochen haben, zum Beispiel Themen wie Klimawandel. Der DFB und die Euro hat sich jetzt zum Beispiel gerade beschlossen, ähnlich wie die Katar-Kollegen, sich der Nachhaltigkeit zu verschreiben. Im Stadionbau, in der Art und Weise, wie die Euro 2024 geführt werden soll. Wie kann gerade der Sport gerade auch solche Themen für Menschen lebbar machen? So I was just saying, what's remarkable is that not only did this collaboration between the German Football Association and the German Foreign Office, I think have a critical impact, maybe not as long-lasting, but a critical impact on the way that Germany was seen in the world, but that sports and sports diplomacy can also refocus to recenter around critical transnational issues, questions of climate change. The Euro 2024 has signed up with the UN Climate Pact to try to influence that as well. How can that shape hearts and minds?
Ja, nicht nur bei so einem Großturnier, sondern also in Deutschland, aber vor allem in Europa, in Amerika ist Fußball nicht die Sportart Nummer 1, aber in Europa ist Fußball die Sportart Nummer 1. Also man erreicht sehr, sehr viele Leute in dem Stadion, in den Verbänden auch, die sehr, sehr viel leisten, und so kann man die Leute wirklich direkt erreichen. Wir müssen uns alle in jeder Entscheidung, die wir treffen, und da würde ich sagen, die Politik, die Wirtschaft, der Sport, alle Bereiche müssen sich bei jeder Entscheidung, die sie treffen, ist es nachhaltig, ist der Klimaschutzgedanke mit im Spiel, weil das essentielle Punkte sind, die man beachten muss bei sowas. Ich habe gestern, war ich auch da, habe einen Vortrag gehört, war sehr, sehr interessant. Also der Gedanke muss immer da sein, nachhaltig und dann in allen Bereichen auch zu denken. Und das wird uns als Euro, die so ein großes Turnier gemeinsam mit der UEFA errichten können, muss es genauso sein.
Wir haben vorhin gesprochen über wachsenden Nationalismus und wie das im Grunde genommen den Multilateralismus in Frage stellt, genau das, was sie in Frage stellt. Und eine Frage an Hassan, eine Frage an Sie. wie kann man das nachhaltig abbauen? Wie kommt gerade auf Natalie bezogen, während wir jetzt eine Konferenz für Europa einberufen, wie können diese unterschiedlichen subnationalen Diplomatieebenen dazu helfen, dass wir wieder ein Teamgefühl bekommen? Hassan. Oh, I should say in English. I realized.
I'm just waiting for the translation. So.
Okay, good.
I think just going to a point I think that was mentioned earlier when it comes to nationalism, the rise of nationalism. Usually, you see the rise of nationalism coming in as a result of economic recession and hardships, and then the protectionism dialogue that kicks in. What sports can do, as I said earlier, is a number of things. First, in hosting major sporting events, just because of the interest that sports has, you have a huge amount of influence that you can push towards corporations, you can push towards states to provide sustainable, inclusive policies, as well as providing initiatives that can alleviate some of the potential issues when it comes to economic recession or otherwise. Educational initiatives. When you marry sports with educational initiatives and spread it out, there's a much more. At least that's what we're looking at, and we're looking. Oh, David's not here anymore. We're looking towards conversations of actually measuring these impacts. So what we've done, for example, with the World Cup from our side, for our region, we've launched initiatives to support entrepreneurs within the region, so that they can use the World Cup as a platform beyond their local markets to regional, global markets, and potentially that has a knock-on effect when we're talking about job creation. When we're looking at educational initiatives, we're trying to uplift the level of the skills of people working within the sporting and hospitality industry that can again contribute or allow for the sporting industry to contribute as a job creator and a contributor to economic growth within the region as well.
And concretely with your stadiums, you're ultimately going to contribute to a development policy issue, right? By taking your stadiums apart once the cup has ended.
That's one of the elements that we're looking at when we're talking about sustainability. For our stadiums, obviously we looked at the capacity needed for the World Cup does not fit the capacity that we need beyond the World Cup. So our stadiums, when we're looking at our stadiums, we're talking about 40,000 seater stadiums that will be reduced to 20,000 seats. The modular seats will be reconfigured and donated to football developing nations. One of our stadiums will be completely dismantled. So the entire stadium is developed, inspired by shipping containers, set up like Legos. At the end of the tournament, the entire building will be taken out, land will be taken back. But the concept goes back again to the issue of every policy that you issue can actually have a long-lasting effect beyond. Now, once you do that, once you alleviate some of those concerns, what you end up then doing is also coming it down to a platform that then allows for dialogue to happen, allows for interaction to happen. I mean, one perfect example is Russia 2018. Regardless of anything else, regardless of everything else, the fact is a lot of people came with a certain perception of the Russian people. Yeah. They left with a very, very different perception of the Russian people, a very positive perception of Russia as a nation and the Russian World Cup. And you see it in Germany in 2006, again, another perfect example where people came in with a certain perceptions, where Germans themselves had a certain perception. And just the fact that you're on one common platform, celebrating, something common to all of us, it helps break down a lot of stereotypes, and that's where you can combat nationalism.
Right, but Natalie, do you feel that for particularly unifying, you said it so eloquently, a ultimately divided Europe that's trying to bring its forces together, does sports diplomacy have an impact?
Well, I think this is fascinating. I mean, I think it's sort of worth reflecting. What is it that is similar and what's different between international sports tournaments and international diplomacy, and therefore what we can learn about it? And I think, beyond the points that you were making about, the way in which sports transcends ethnic, religious, social backgrounds, the way in which sports can be reutilized for sustainability purposes, the one thought that really comes to mind is there are some elements that are very similar to international diplomacy. So ultimately, international sports tournaments are a domain in which there is patriotism. At times, there is even nationalism. There's, by definition, competition. And at times, that competition can even sort of spill into conflict. But there is one thing that makes it different from the way in which in the domain of international politics, often things go wrong. And this goes back to Joe's point about the story. There is a common purpose to it. different teams compete, different publics compete and may even contrast, but they're all there to they all want to enjoy a good game of football. And ultimately it's that shared story which we need to build on by working on the many-to-many that Joe was referring to, which I think is ultimately the main distinction between why is it that it works when it comes to international sports. There is those shared norms, those shared institutions, because ultimately there is a shared goal of simply wanting to enjoy, which we don't have, or we have to work on when it comes to international diplomacy.
So I want to look specifically, and this is our last round, because I know we're all looking to run off, but this has been such a fascinating conversation. Before we think about the Euro 2024, we have 1 Euro before, and that's a pan-European Cup. And we are in a process of trying to rethink and reconnecting Europe to its meaning, defending what its values are, re-engaging with the public through this Conference for Europe that this global commission, this globalized thinking commission has put into place. Philipp, Sie sind der Botschafter für München als Teil dieser europäisch gedachten Euro. Diese ganzen Themen, wie bringen wir ein europäisches Gefühl rein, wenn dann auch noch die Stadien, wir fangen an im Stadio Olimpico in Rom, wir enden im Wembley-Stadion, denn trotz Brexit ist England natürlich immer noch geografisch Teil eines Europas. Wie soll da der Narrativ fließen, Ihrer Meinung nach? Inwiefern kann es anknüpfen an diese Dimension?
Ich finde, was da das Entscheidende ist der Austausch. Also erstmal finde ich, ist es ein toller Gedanke, ein europäisches Turnier. Es dürfen Nationen Ausrichter sein, die normal alleine nie die Möglichkeit hätten, so ein Turnier auszurichten, Teil eines großen Gemeinschaftsprojektes zu sein. Und dann ist es entscheidend, wie die Städte sich untereinander austauschen. Und was ich mitbekomme, ist es unglaublich, wie die Städte sich untereinander austauschen, ob das in Sachen Volunteering ist, in Sachen Stadion, in Sachen Mobilität. Es ist ein Austausch da und ich glaube, das ist das Entscheidende. Man muss sich austauschen, um dann wieder Lösungen zu finden. Das merke ich jetzt gerade, weil viele Nationen dabei sind, wie Ungarn, wie Rumänien, die hätten normal keine Möglichkeit, eine Europameisterschaft oder Teil eines großen Projekts zu sein, wo Leute von verschiedenen Ländern zu ihnen reisen. Das wäre normal nicht möglich und das wird ihnen geboten. Und wir, auch in Hinsicht auf 2024, machen uns, Sie haben vorher gefragt, was wir in Sachen Nachhaltigkeit auch, zum Beispiel Mobilität. Ich glaube, der Fußball ist ein großer Kommunikator und erreicht viele Leute, aber es geht nicht, dass der Fußball alleine etwas in Bewegung tritt, sondern da braucht er wirklich Experten aus allen Bereichen, um dann etwas Großes zu schaffen, um dann darüber hinaus zu denken.
Hassan, in Katar haben Sie natürlich auch die Ziele für 2022 aufgebaut, auf die Entwicklungsziele Katars. I mean, you combined the need for Qatar's own development with exactly these topics. And so in one last round, I want to bring together in part what Ambika raised in terms of the city diplomacy, how it reinvigorates this connection. Maybe it was a strategic choice by the Commission President to tie these things together, who knows, to create that kind of resonance. But pairing wider goals with an empathic and an empathetic force to the both of you, what do you think what will be that impact?
In terms of tying the development goals with the tournament
exactly.
itself, it's. I mean, if you look at what we've done over the last 10 years, when we planned to host the World Cup, we linked it directly with the national development goal, economic diversification, environmental sustainability, human development, and social development, and the World Cup served as a very effective vehicle to achieving those goals. Mass transportation, for example, we've developed a metro system within a short period of time. Initially, there was a reluctance. We are used to driving cars, driving everywhere. The mode of transportation, the frame of mind of actually how to commute in Qatar has changed dramatically. In 2019, last year, we actually opened up the metro system. People that thought they would never use a public transportation system are using it today. The concept of sustainability has become, environmental sustainability has become at the forefront of our mind. But it's taken 10 years. This is one thing that I wanted to point out when we're talking about the fleeting nature of these events. In 10 years, we've worked diligently day in, day out to start, to deliver on the nation's development goals as we deliver the World Cup, whether it's operational or infrastructure-wise or building connections between people. And it's gradually started delivering only now. It takes a long time to benefit out of these tournaments. Sometimes these tournaments are granted to nations 4 years ahead of time, and it's a relatively short period of time to benefit a lot out of it. But I mean, we hosted the Club World Cup last year. We had fans coming in from Brazil, from England, throughout the different worlds supporting their teams. A lot of these fans came originally when we interacted with them with an apprehension of the Middle East and of Qatar, of a lot of the stories that they heard, of a lot of the things the picture that they drew about the nation before they came. They left with a completely different picture. And it's how much are we investing in benefiting and taking the most out of these events.
Natalie, you're out of that advisory role now, but we're coming up
actually
at...
still in it.
Well, there you go. Good. Then this is a perfect way to end. We're coming up for 5 critical years, I think, for Europe. We talked about how it's squeezed through great power competition, how it's trying to muscle up, perhaps too slow, perhaps too ineffectual. But it's given this platform to re-engage with European citizens, to re-engage with all the stakeholders that you have to bring into this conversation in the Conference for Europe. Listening to these guys, listening to Joe, what advice do you give the 30,000-foot level on how to make that connection effective?
Well, I mean, I think it's really a question of how to reformulate the European narrative. Why is it that we are European Union today? And it's not only, I mean, obviously it's still important, but it's not only the quote-unquote old story, peace on the continent after 2 devastating world wars. Yeah. It's not only the prosperity of the single market. It is a sort of quintessentially global rationale, precisely because of great power competition, because of the transnational challenges of climate and digital and demography. Ultimately, the level of the nation state in Europe is simply too small. Now, it doesn't mean to say that everything has to be done at the supranational level, and indeed there is a lot that has to be done at the subnational level, but you need to have that level of sort of weight and size in order to be at those tables. And I think doing it also by reappropriating, which is indeed what the Commission President has tried to do, appropriating the sustainability debate, and in particular through climate, as something that resonates with citizens, and making them realize, which I think they understand perfectly well. I mean, the sort of Greta generation understands that the level at which one has to pitch advocacy cannot just be the national one.
Right.
So it's a question of reconnecting that local and that individual level to the supranational level, which I think is the way in which we can reacquire a story that resonates.
Right, and this gets to this point about our Western values or universal values and how we connect that again. So we started our discussion. There's a reason we ended up with this particular circle. I did orchestrate this for a reason, because we wanted to depart from the 30,000-foot level in diplomacy. I think what we've heard from all of our participants today is that there is, as Joe said, there's a crisis of credibility. There's a crisis of humanness. There's a crisis of empathy in diplomacy and in closeness and understanding that, conflict emerges from individuals. And so I think with the group of people who we have in this final circle, Natalie, who has been in charge of trying to think about how we forge a European unity behind a diplomacy that brings together its values, Lassina, who's been trying to harness the energies of the member states, the signatory states of the treaty, but then to make science and data speak for itself so that there's advocacy behind it, there's power behind it. And then both Philipp and Hassan, who have invested in making sports a human and empathic, a connective piece. And of course, Joe Nye, our distinguished professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, who has put a thought to how this resonates and now metrics of how this resonates. So we need the diplomacy in the main hall. We need to have these complicated conversations. But at the end of the day, this is also how we're going to connect diplomacy to democracy and make it work for all of us. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.